I turned one of the richest neighborhoods in central Arizona into a place where people couldn't even open their front doors without getting a face full of red dust. And the strangest part is that I never touched a single one of their houses. I didn't vandalize anything, I didn't threaten anyone, and I didn't break the law. All I did was stop pretending that my family's kindness was an obligation. And within 2 weeks, 300 luxury homes looked like they had been abandoned in the middle of the desert. But to understand why that happened, you have to understand my father, because none of this story really starts with me. My name is Elena Morales. I'm 35 years old, and for most of my adult life I worked as a civil engineer designing drainage systems and reviewing construction plans that other people never bothered to read. My coworkers joked that I trusted paperwork more than people, and maybe they were right, because paper has a funny habit of remembering the truth long after people decide to rewrite it. I grew up on a little family farm outside Casa Verde, a quiet place where the mornings smelled like damp soil and pepper leaves instead of fresh asphalt. My father came to America in the late 1980s carrying one suitcase, an old toolbox, and a coffee tin full of pepper seeds wrapped inside newspaper. Those seeds had belonged to his grandfather back in Mexico, and he used to tell me that every family leaves something behind for the next generation. Some leave money, some leave land, but the lucky ones leave knowledge. We never had much money, and the land wasn't worth much when my parents bought it because nobody wanted to farm that close to the desert. The summers were brutally hot, the winters were unpredictable, and every dollar seemed to disappear into irrigation pipes, fertilizer, and equipment repairs. Yet my father loved every inch of that place. When I was 7 years old, he built a greenhouse almost entirely with recycled materials. He bought used steel from a warehouse auction, repaired cracked supports himself, and spent nights drilling bolts under floodlights while my mother brought him coffee in a thermos. I remember sitting on overturned buckets pretending to help while he explained that good things grow slowly. Anyone can buy vegetables, he would say, but growing them teaches patience. The greenhouse became his world. Inside were rows of peppers, tomatoes, herbs, experimental hybrids, and notebooks filled with tiny handwritten observations about flavor, drought tolerance, and harvest times. He treated those plants like family members. If one survived a harsh season, he'd save its seeds. If another produced sweeter fruit, he'd cross-pollinate it and start again the following year. 30 years later, that little greenhouse held genetics that couldn't be replaced by simply ordering a packet online. They represented thousands of mornings, thousands of mistakes, and thousands of tiny victories that nobody else ever noticed. While our farm slowly grew stronger, everything around us changed. Investors discovered the area, and suddenly bulldozers arrived with glossy advertisements promising luxury, living surrounded by nature. I always laughed at that slogan because the first thing they did was flatten half the nature they were advertising. Within a few years, enormous homes appeared where open fields used to be. There were decorative lakes, fountains running all day, imported palm trees, and bright green lawns that looked almost unnatural against the dry Arizona landscape. They named the development Canyon Vista Estates, which sounded impressive enough to justify million-dollar price tags. At first we worried the new neighbors would try to push us out, but many families were perfectly decent. Children rode bicycles past our fence, retirees stopped to ask gardening questions, and every spring my father gave away pepper seedlings to anyone willing to plant them. "Take two," he'd tell people. "If one dies, the other deserves a chance." Even after I finished college and started my engineering career in the city, I drove back every weekend because helping my father never felt like work. We'd repair irrigation lines, argue about fertilizer, laugh over broken equipment, and then sit outside watching the sunset turn the mountains orange. When he passed away unexpectedly 2 years before all this happened, the greenhouse became the only place where I still felt like I could hear him. I kept everything almost exactly as he left it. His gloves still hung from a nail. His measuring tape still sat on the workbench. His notebook still had a pencil tucked inside halfway through a page describing a pepper variety that needed one more season of testing. Friends told me to sell the property because land values had exploded. Developers mailed offers every month. Some were polite, others were aggressive, but I never seriously considered it. That farm wasn't an investment. It was the physical memory of my parents' entire life together. Then came a Tuesday that started so normally, it almost feels unfair to remember. I spent the morning reviewing stormwater calculations for a municipal project complained about bad office coffee, and called my younger brother Mateo to remind him that we needed to transplant seedlings over the weekend. He joked that Dad was probably somewhere shaking his head because engineers always overcomplicated farming. I laughed, finished work, picked up groceries, and drove toward the farm with the windows down. About a mile from the property, I noticed something strange. The greenhouse usually reflected sunlight like a giant piece of glass sitting in the field, but I couldn't see that familiar shimmer. I told myself the angle was different. Another 30 seconds passed, and a feeling settled into my stomach that I still can't fully explain. Then I turned onto our dirt road and hit the brakes so hard that my grocery bags flew onto the passenger side floor. The greenhouse was gone. Not damaged. Not partially collapsed. Gone. The ground where it had stood for decades was covered with twisted metal, shattered panels, crushed planting tables, broken irrigation lines, and bulldozer tracks cutting through the soil like fresh wounds. For several seconds I couldn't move because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Then I jumped out of the truck and started digging through the debris with my bare hands, lifting broken frames and scattered trays until I found dozens of seed containers smashed into the dirt. Tiny handwritten labels in my father's handwriting were soaked with mud and impossible to read. Years of work had been destroyed in a single afternoon. As I stood there trying to process everything, a laminated notice hanging from our fence caught my attention. It claimed the structure had been removed because it violated a setback requirement and encroached on protected property limits. I read every word carefully, then read it again, and something inside me changed. The grief was still there, but now it had company. Because whoever wrote that notice had made one mistake that would eventually cost them far more than rebuilding a greenhouse. They assumed nobody left on this farm understood maps, measurements, or the law. They had no idea they had just picked a fight with an engineer who had learned paperwork from a farmer who never threw a single document away. I carried that old metal box down to the kitchen table, wiped decades of dust from the lid, and started opening folders that smelled like dry paper and greenhouse soil. My father never trusted computers. He trusted binders, handwritten notes, and receipts folded so many times they looked like tiny accordions. At first, I found seed inventories, pump repair invoices, tax forms, and faded photographs of him standing next to the very first greenhouse frame with a grin that made him look 20 years younger. Then, buried beneath a county survey map, I noticed a thick envelope stamped with the words Water Access Agreement. I unfolded the pages carefully and immediately switched into engineer mode. Every line, every diagram, every signature told a story. Long before Canyon Vista Estates existed, the irrigation canal feeding our farm had been granted a permanent maintenance corridor. The county retained water authority, but access to the service gate crossed our property through a permissive agreement signed with my father because he had built and maintained part of the system for years. The language was dry, boring, and full of legal phrases nobody reads until they absolutely have to. But one sentence practically jumped off the page. Continued access depended upon the landowner's permission and cooperation. I read it again just to make sure my anger wasn't inventing words that didn't exist. Then I called an attorney I knew from a transportation project. He listened quietly while I explained everything and finally said, "Elena, don't do anything emotional. Let me review the documents." An hour later, he called back and sighed. Legally speaking, they may have created a very expensive problem for themselves. That night, I barely slept. Part of me wanted revenge. Another part remembered my father telling me that real strength comes from letting other people create their own consequences. By sunrise, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to damage anyone's property. I wasn't going to threaten anybody. I was simply going to exercise rights that already existed. 2 days later, a steel contractor installed a heavy security gate across the maintenance entrance leading through our land. County officials were notified. The water district received copies of the documents. Notices were posted explaining that access was temporarily suspended pending resolution of property damage and restoration negotiations. Everything was documented, photographed, and delivered through certified mail. Even my attorney joked that the paperwork probably weighed more than the gate itself. The first morning after the closure seemed almost disappointing. I expected chaos, but nothing happened. Luxury SUVs rolled out of driveways. Joggers waved at each other. Lawn crews unloaded equipment. Life looked perfectly normal. Around noon, my neighbor, Mr. Dalton, who had always been friendly, stopped his pickup beside my fence. "Something going on with the canal?" he asked. I shrugged. "There's a legal dispute." He scratched his beard and drove away. Then the phone calls began. A landscaping contractor wanted to know when maintenance vehicles could enter. A property manager asked whether there had been a misunderstanding. By evening, someone from the homeowners association left a voicemail demanding immediate cooperation. I returned none of them. Day 3 brought visible changes. The automatic sprinklers clicked on before sunrise, spraying little bursts of air instead of water in several sections because pressure throughout the distribution system had become inconsistent during maintenance delays. Most homeowners assumed it was a temporary mechanical issue. They posted complaints in neighborhood groups about poor landscaping service. Day 6 was different. The emerald lawns that looked so perfect in real estate brochures developed pale yellow streaks. Decorative flowers wilted. Dust lifted behind every passing car and settled onto mailboxes, patio furniture, and shiny black SUVs that suddenly looked rust-colored. I drove past the subdivision on my way to town and almost laughed when I saw 4 different landscaping companies inspecting sprinkler heads while arguing with each other. They were fixing symptoms instead of the cause. My brother Mateo called that evening. "People are talking," he said. "About what?" "About you. Half the neighborhood thinks you're suing them. The other half thinks the county shut everything down." "Good," I answered. "Maybe they'll start asking better questions." A week later, someone finally knocked on my front door hard enough to shake the frame. Standing outside was a woman wearing designer sunglasses, an expensive blazer despite the heat, and the kind of expression that said she wasn't used to hearing the word no. "I'm Patricia Holloway," she announced before I could speak. "President of Canyon Vista Estates." I nodded. "I'm Elena." She glanced toward the greenhouse ruins behind me and then back at the gate. "This inconvenience has gone far enough." I almost smiled at her choice of words. "An inconvenience?" I asked. "Your actions are affecting hundreds of homeowners." "Interesting," I replied. "Because your bulldozers affected one family, and somehow that wasn't considered a problem." She folded her arms. "The structure violated community setbacks." I walked inside, grabbed the survey map, and handed it to her. "Read the measurements." She barely looked at it. "Our architectural committee already determined the violation." "Then your architectural committee should buy a tape measure." For the first time, her confidence slipped. She asked if we could discuss a practical solution. I invited her to the porch where my father used to drink coffee every evening and placed a folder between us. Inside was a detailed estimate prepared by contractors and agricultural specialists. Reconstruction costs, lost equipment, replacement structures, estimated value of destroyed seed stock, preservation work, historical documentation. The total made even me swallow hard when I first saw it. Patricia stared at the number for several seconds. "You're asking this association to pay all of this?" "No," I answered calmly. "I'm asking the people responsible to restore what they destroyed." She leaned back and laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind people use when they hope confidence will hide uncertainty. "You think one farm can pressure an entire community?" I looked toward the empty greenhouse foundation where my father once stood teaching neighborhood children how to transplant peppers. "No," I said quietly. "I think one bad decision can." She removed her sunglasses and looked directly at me. "Developers built this neighborhood. People invested millions here. Do you understand who you're fighting?" I met her eyes without raising my voice. "Do you understand whose signatures are on those documents?" Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The wind carried another wave of fine red dust across the road. Somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler clicked uselessly against dry soil. Patricia finally gathered the papers, stood up, and said, "This isn't over." I watched her expensive SUV disappear toward the subdivision, and for the first time since finding the destroyed greenhouse, I had the strange feeling that the real story wasn't beginning with the bulldozers. It was beginning with what powerful people do after they realize someone they underestimated actually knows the rules better than they do. The next week felt like watching a slow-motion storm that everyone could see except the people who had started it. Canyon Vista Estates had money, lawyers, consultants, and public relations people, but none of those things could make grass grow without water or erase photographs of a greenhouse that had been standing legally for decades. Local reporters began calling. One article described the dispute as a disagreement between a luxury subdivision and a family farm. Another interviewed longtime residents who remembered bringing their children to my father's greenhouse every spring to pick tomato seedlings for free. One elderly woman told the reporter, "That man never asked for anything except respect." Those words spread through the community faster than any legal notice ever could. Then the homeowners started asking questions at their association meeting. Who approved the demolition? Was there really a survey? Why hadn't the board verified the property line? Why were association funds now being spent on attorneys instead of fixing the problem? Patricia tried to control the room, but every answer created two new questions. Finally, a retired surveyor who happened to live in the neighborhood stood up with copies of county maps and quietly explained that the greenhouse appeared to comply with the recorded setback requirements. The room became completely silent. You could almost hear people recalculating everything they had been told. 3 days later, my attorney called. They're ready to negotiate. We met inside a conference room that looked expensive enough to intimidate most people, but after spending my childhood helping my father repair broken irrigation pumps under 100-degree sun, polished wood tables didn't scare me. Their legal team opened with complicated language about mutual cooperation and future relationships. My attorney slid our documentation across the table and simply said, "Restoration comes first." Hours passed. Numbers changed. Conditions were added and removed. Eventually, someone from the association admitted what nobody had wanted to say out loud. The demolition should never have happened. That single sentence changed the entire conversation. By sunset, we had an agreement. The association would fund a complete reconstruction of the greenhouse using updated materials while preserving my father's original design. They would compensate for the destroyed equipment and contribute to a local agricultural scholarship honoring families who had farmed the region for generations. More importantly, they agreed that any future project affecting our shared boundary would require proper surveys and direct communication instead of assumptions. When I walked outside after signing the papers, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Revenge had sounded satisfying when I first saw the rubble, but somewhere along the way the goal had changed. I didn't want their neighborhood to fail. I wanted people to understand that history matters and that progress built by ignoring those who came before eventually creates its own problems. Construction on the new greenhouse began a month later. My brother Mateo volunteered every weekend, and neighbors I had never met showed up carrying tools, sandwiches, and even trays of seedlings. One little boy handed me a packet of pepper seeds and whispered, "My grandma said your dad would want you to have these." I thanked him and had to look away before he noticed my eyes filling with tears. On the day we finished, we mounted a simple wooden plaque near the entrance. It didn't mention lawsuits, money, or legal victories. It simply read, "Built again with respect." The first time water flowed through the irrigation lines into the new beds, the sound reminded me of my father laughing after fixing an old pump that everyone else had declared impossible to repair. Across the road, the lawns and canyon vistas slowly returned to green. Children rode bicycles again, and life settled into something resembling peace. Every now and then I still drive past the neighborhood entrance where new board members wave instead of looking away. Some people say I was too stubborn. Others say the association got exactly what it deserved. Maybe both are true, but whenever someone asks me what the biggest lesson was, I always give the same answer. Documents matter. Respect matters even more. Because the easiest thing in the world is to knock down something another family spent 30 years building. But rebuilding trust takes far longer than rebuilding glass and steel. So now I'd like to ask you something. If you were standing where I stood that afternoon, looking at the ruins of your family's life's work, would you have gone straight to court, accepted an apology, or fought back by using every legal right available to you? Tell me what you think.